Have you ever read Bart Ehrman's books? Have you ever read any of his books? I've met many people who read them, and I've seen them. Their books are all highlighted with all the points that he makes. But I want to ask you a question as we begin this episode. Do you check what he says? Do you check what he says? Because that's what we do on this channel. We read his book and we check what he says. And today we're going to be looking at a contradiction that he says, is one of the contradictions that he gives to his students. So, hi, Matthew. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
How you doing? Yeah, you too.
So where are we up to?
Well, we're up to the second chapter, which is called A World of Contradictions. So it sounds like he's going to throw a whole lot of
contradictions.
A whole lot of contradictions from the Bible. That's what he's going to give us in this chapter. So I might just read. He goes on a bit, and to get the gist of it, we don't need to read every paragraph. So we've got a few selected bits we'll read to give a feel for it, and then get into the chapter. Yeah. So Ehrman says at the beginning of the chapter, when students are first introduced to the historical as opposed to a devotional study of the Bible, one of the first things they are forced to grapple with is that the biblical text, whether Old Testament or New Testament, is chock full of discrepancies, many of them irreconcilable.
Chock full,
irreconcilable. Yeah. So a little lower, he says, in this chapter, I'll talk about some of the more important and interesting discrepancies of the Bible that emerge when it is examined from a historical perspective. Since my specialty is the New Testament, I will be dealing with the kinds of problems that are found there. But you can rest assured that that very much the same problems can be found in the Old Testament as well. In fact, even more so. And then a little bit below again to finish this bit, he says, my goal is not to point out every discrepancy that can be discovered in the New Testament, but only some of the most interesting or important ones.
Okay.
Great. So that's kind of the orientation of the chapter and what he's setting out to do. What do you think, Sam?
Well, I guess I want to look at the examples that he gives, because he's saying these are the big, interesting, important ones. So,
yep.
If I'm a reader and I'm listening to Bart Ehrman and I know nothing of the Bible, I'd be going, wow, he's going to show me ones which are absolute and certain and obvious.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's promising, isn't he?
Yeah, and he's also appealing to an area of his expertise, that he is a scholar in Testament studies, so we should expect that he'd have some of the most insightful things to say here, I suppose. So I suppose let's continue and see.
Well, hang on. So he goes on. What was it at the bottom of page 21? Yep. You're going to read for us something about horizontal versus vertical. What is that about?
Yeah, all right. He talks about reading things in order from beginning to end. He says that's the most natural way of reading a book from beginning to end. I call this approach vertical reading. You start at the top of the page and move to the bottom. Start at the beginning of the book and move to the end. There is absolutely nothing wrong with reading the Gospels this way, as this is no doubt how they were written to be read. But there is another way to read them, horizontally. In horizontal reading, you read a story in one of the Gospels and then read the same story as told by another Gospel, as if they were written in columns next to each other. And then you compare the stories carefully in detail.
Okay. So in other words, he's saying he wants us now to compare the Gospels next to each other for the same event. And he's going to be bringing out contradictions when we compare, each gospel to others for the same event.
Yes, yeah, it is. It is also striking, of course, because earlier in the book he has a rant against the idea of combining the testimonies of the gospel narratives into one coherent whole. He's only interested in reading them alongside each other to try and find contradictions, which is striking. I think both activities could be worthwhile if they're done in the right manner. But
Christians do that. I mean, I've got
that's right. Yeah,
a harmony of the four Gospels.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it's a responsible historical approach to try and work out how they fit together.
It puts them all into parallel columns and compares them in
great. So it's
ways.
doing exactly what he's describing, and
yeah.
So it's not a bad approach. Yeah, it's certainly got value. But he's signaling that he thinks when you do that, you find there's heaps of discrepancies that are really obvious and really undermine the Bible. So that'll be what we'll be looking for as we look for these comparisons.
Yeah, and that's what he says. If you at the bottom of verse 22, if you're interested in finding discrepancies yourself, it is in fact very easy to do. And he says, pick a parallel story and read it, and you're just going to find them. Yep. Well, look, the first one he gives us here is on page 23, and he says, and so it's under the title of an opening illustration, the death of Jesus in Mark and John. And he says here, this is an illustration of discrepancies within the New Testament that I frequently use with my students. It is a, quote, textbook case, because both Mark and John give explicit indications of when Jesus dies, and he dies at different times depending on which gospel you read. Now, he then goes on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7 pages for this illustration. So we're not going to read all 7 pages.
And to get the point, you don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is this contradiction that he's talking about?
Well, do you want me to read the next bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, he comes to page 27 and he gives us a summation of it. He says, so the contradiction stands. Here's a summary of what each gospel says is different, allegedly. So in Mark, Jesus eats the Passover meal on Thursday night and is crucified the following morning. In John, Jesus does not eat the Passover meal, but is crucified on the day before the Passover meal was to be eaten. Moreover, in Mark, Jesus is nailed to the cross at 9 a.m. In John, he is not condemned till noon, and then he's taken out and crucified. And then just looking at the next page that supplements that a little bit, he says, in other words, John has changed a historical datum in order to make a theological point. Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. And to convey this theological point, John has had to create a discrepancy between his account and others. So not only has he got the discrepancy here, he's saying that John's to blame. John's the one who changed the story to make his Jesus the Passover lamb point.
So the question is, how does he work out what day Jesus is being crucified, or how can we know what day Jesus was crucified? And it comes down to what's called the preparation day.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Mark and Luke, and Bart Ehrman brings this up in his chapter, he says, if you look at these 2 verses, it says it was preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath.
Yep.
And it's saying that this is the day that Jesus was crucified on preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. And so we can identify a day, the day before the Sabbath. But he says in John's gospel, it says it was the day of preparation of Passover week. And so John doesn't say preparation of the Sabbath in this verse. He says it's the preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. And so he's saying, well, there are different preparation days. There's the preparation for the Sabbath, which is the day in which Jesus is crucified in Mark and Luke. But it's the preparation for the Passover, which is a different day, for when Jesus is crucified in John. And so that's his claim here. He's claiming that, there's different preparation days and different gospels are saying different things. And John has deliberately changed the day so as to make Jesus be crucified when the Passover lamb was being crucified. It was being sacrificed.
Yep.
So that's sort of his argument here. Well, let's have a look at this. The first thing I want to say is that it's not that easy to say which meal Jesus is actually celebrating at that time. Is he actually celebrating the meal of the full Passover or just one of the Passover meals that happened during the whole week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So we read, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover. Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a whole week's celebration where they would the Jews would eat bread without yeast in it, and they would remember the Exodus through this. And the high point was the Passover sacrifice. But the whole thing, as you can see in Luke, is called the Passover week, right? It's the whole thing's got to do with that. So there are meals that you're having throughout that whole week, which are Passover meals, some with just bread and, bread and wine or bread and water, whatever they're having, others with the lamb, but the eating goes over a whole week. So that's the first thing.
Yeah. So the reference to Passover can be quite broad.
It can be quite broad. But secondly, this. Ehrman has said that the Passover in John, the day of preparation in John, is the day when the Passover was made. But when you actually read the rest of John, it actually says it's the Passover, and then it identifies it as the day before the Sabbath. So since it was the day of preparation, which is what what Mark and Luke say, the day of preparation.
Yep, that's right.
Now, Ehrman's saying it's the day of preparation for the Passover, but notice what John goes on to say, since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. For that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate to have their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So you see how this preparation, this is the day now before the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And yeah. So look, my point with that is that Mark and Luke and John are all talking about the Passover. Oh, mate. My point is that Mark, Luke, and John are all talking about the preparation day before the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So they're all talking about exactly the same day. And what I find telling is that in all the 7 pages that Ehrman brought up on this example, he doesn't refer to John 19 verse 31, which actually shows against everything he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it contradicts his point.
Yeah. I'll just go back so people can get that, right? So in Mark and in Luke, it says it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. And in Luke, it was preparation day and the Sabbath was about to begin. And then Ehrman is saying that the Sabbath, this is not the preparation day for the Sabbath in John's gospel. So that's his point. He's saying it's a different preparation day. But when you read John 19, verse 31, you see that it is the preparation day before the Sabbath. And that's why they, if the Sabbath wasn't the next day, then they'd be saying, well, we can come the next day and finish it off. But they've got to have, the deaths happening today because they can't do it on the Sabbath, which is going to be the next day. So
it's very significant, Sam, because you look at he makes a big deal of it. He's just said that this is a textbook example, and he finishes the section by making very forceful and big conclusions. He says that there's discrepancies in the book of the New Testament; they can't be reconciled. He says it is impossible that both Mark's and John's accounts are historically accurate, since they contradict each other on the question of when Jesus died, which we've just seen is untrue, and this is his best case.
This is his opening example. And as I said, he's giving all the verses, but he leaves out the one verse, John 19:31, which undoes his whole argument.
Yeah.
Right? John 19:31 undoes his whole argument. It shows that it's the preparation day before the Sabbath, but it's the one that happens during the Passover. So it's the preparation day of the Passover, because the Sabbath falls within the Passover. So there's a preparation day of the Passover, right? And
And so what he wants to say as well in conclusion is that we need to try to understand what each author is trying to say on their own terms. And so look at the details of each account is how he finishes. And what we're saying is, well, yeah, we can do that. And we've just done that. Sure, John has this distinct emphasis on Jesus as the Passover lamb, but he does it with the same historical facts. He's just he's just making a similar theological points in a different way. He's drawing on a different imagery to make his points about the significance of what Jesus' death was about. But that's not in tension with it being historically factual at the same time. It's just pointing to different aspects of the significance of what Jesus' death was about.
Yes. Yeah. And when we read each one and look at all the time markers, we see that they're saying exactly the same day.
Yeah.
That it happened on the day of preparation for the Sabbath, and it happened on that day before the Sabbath. And so that's why they came and spoke to Pilate the way they did. And all of the Gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, which all mention this, say exactly the same thing. So,
well, he has got a rest of a chapter with examples, so we'll get to those in due course. Is the intention?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that'll do us for today, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Thank you.